Testing 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we're about ready to rock and roll, I think. Good to have everybody. And we're studying the book of Acts. We're going to get through with the book of Acts before they finish the highway project. I believe it now. I didn't think we would until I saw they tore up another lane that's coming into this bridge on Highway 15. If you're coming from the other side of town, you don't know what in the world I'm talking about. But if you're coming from Ecru north, they tore up that pavement. And so me and Bill's going to finish this before they finish the highway. All right, so, but it's a great blessing to be here today. And before we get started in our lesson, if anybody that needs to be prayed for, we'll be happy to do that at this time. Does anybody have anybody? Okay. I see. Right. We've prayed for her before. All right. Thank you for letting us know.
My sister, she came home, she's stable, and
good.
Sister Barbara Jean Bobo, she goes on 178, she, her daughter, she's stable.
Okay, good. Good report. All right, thank you, Perry. Anybody else? Think of? All right, we'll say Happy Mother's Day to everyone as well. And Steve Hill, you'd be so kind to lead us in a word of prayer. Appreciate it.
Pray together. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time we've gathered together to study a portion of the Word. Lord, we pray for those that you mentioned this morning. Pray for all the mothers today as we celebrate Mother's Day. Lord, we thank you for all the many blessings you bestow upon us every day. You know we're fail people. We fall short of you, Lord. Lord, we thank you for all things.
Amen. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. And now there it is. Okay, good. Kind of comes and goes. Well, we're in the book of Acts. We're in chapter 24. We almost finished chapter 24 last week. And I don't know how far we'll get, but I know we'll finish chapter 24. Okay? We don't lack very much. We only lack from verse 22 or so down to the end of the chapter, which is to verse 27. So we've been introduced to the governor of Judea. Y'all remember his name is Felix. And he is the one now that has Paul basically in custody. Felix is in a conundrum. He is in a real tight spot. He was appointed as governor of Judea by Claudius. Now there was two ways to become a Roman emperor. One way was for the Roman Senate to appoint you. The other way was if the emperor appointed you. So he had been appointed by the Emperor Claudius. But there's a problem with that. Claudius has died. He died in 54 AD, and this is getting on up to be about right around 57 AD. Okay, so guess who is the emperor now? Four-letter word. Nero. Thank you. Good. Well, Felix knows his time is coming up. Now, they didn't have like 4-year terms or 6-year terms like a senator does or whatever. But at the whim of Nero, he could just replace Felix and put whoever he wanted in. And Felix knew that since Claudius had died, that was a real possibility for him. So he knew that he wasn't going to be governor probably for very much longer. And so he knows his time is limited. I like to say what he did in the last 5 verses here of chapter 24 is he ran out the clock. He didn't want to make the Jews mad, so he keeps Paul in custody. He didn't want to make Nero mad. He didn't want to ruffle any feathers or make any waves in the city of Rome. So he just sits on his hands, basically, and keeps Paul under wraps, which keeps the Jews happy, but he doesn't have Paul sent to Rome. And so, as I said, he just runs out the clock. Yes, exactly. He played it both ways as best as he could. Yes, he did. Right, Bill. All right, so we'll read this quickly, and I won't say much more about it because I've already said some things. But Felix, verse 22, chapter 24, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will decide your case. Lysias isn't coming. He probably knew that. And he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet to have some freedom and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. Now, who was nearby in Caesarea that would have possibly ministered to Paul? Wasn't too many chapters ago. Isn't this where Philip lived? Remember? I believe Philip is living in the neighborhood. Philip probably would have ministered. Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. Remember them? There was a prophet Agabus, right? So he had some friends in the vicinity, right? And there would have been other people that would have come to see Paul, and he had that kind of freedom here. He's going to get similar treatment, by the way, on his way to Rome. Acts 27 and verse 3, Paul is given some freedom. His friends are allowed to take care of his needs. And then when he gets to Rome, he is allowed to stay alone with only one guard, at least for a time, in rented quarters. So the Romans don't have the same feeling about Paul that the Jews had. And yet they had him in custody, which kept the Jews at arm's length. That's how Felix is playing this. Verse 24, but some days later Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, or who was Jewish, and sent for Paul, and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you. And so if you stop right there, you think, oh, Felix, he's a good guy, isn't he? He wants to hear the gospel. He is, his mind is open. His heart is open. And then you go to verse 27, and that's the real reason Felix wants to keep him around. Money. He's hoping for a bribe, right? Verse 27, 26, I'm sorry. At the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. So it was always under this pretext of, Paul preached to me something, give me some information, but in the back of his mind, it was, and probably not really the back of his mind. It was probably, slide me a little donation and I can get you out of here. But Paul never did. And that's the sad thing. And then the sad statement, which is in at least 1 or 2 invitation songs, go away for the present, Felix says, and when I find time, I will summon you. There back in verse 25. And of course, that's, we see that in Almost Persuaded, right? It's almost word for word. Seems now some soul to say, go spirit, go thy way. Some more convenient day on thee I'll call. But Paul never wavers. Paul is always going to be preaching the gospel. He gives them a 3-part sermon. You might say it was even entitled Faith in Christ. And so what are the three, always got to have 3 points, right? Danny had 3 points this morning, right? The 3 points in this sermon, which Paul has preached over and over again, are righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. If you put your faith in Christ and live right, live faithfully, you don't have any problem with the judgment to come. And that's Paul's message to Felix. But what Felix wants, he wants something now. He wants something that can help him in this life. He's not interested in the eternal. And that's the problem we run into today with a lot of folks. So then we find that Felix is succeeded. He ran out the clock. Mission accomplished for Felix. He didn't get any money, but he didn't make the Jews too mad, and he didn't make Nero mad. Now it's Paul is somebody else's problem. And we find out who that is. So let's read verses 1 through 5 of chapter 25. Anybody got anything they want to add to the end of chapter 24? All right. I do appreciate your comments, and they are welcome. All right. So, chapter 25. Festus, therefore, having arrived in the province 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem at the same time, setting an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore he said, "Let the influential men among you go there with me. And if there is anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him." So Festus is generally regarded to be a more competent ruler than Felix was. And he is shrewd here in this. First of all, he traveled to Jerusalem from Caesarea. That's over 50 miles. All right. Now, the Roman capital of Judea is Caesarea, but one of his main concerns is what's going on in Jerusalem. And of course, the Jews regard their capital as Jerusalem. So they get a lot of attention from Festus, but Paul was really not on the top of the agenda, okay? The Jews still want Paul tried in Jerusalem. Others want Paul dead, but Festus is not going to make Paul. He's going to give Paul the choice, but he's not going to make him go to Jerusalem, and he could have. Now, what we don't know is if Festus was aware of the plot for Paul to be ambushed or killed, or both. All right, we don't know what he knew. But he's not going to force Paul to go to Jerusalem. So we pick it up in about verse 6, and we're going to read on down through verse 12 here. And after he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea. And this is Festus going back to Caesarea. And on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. And after he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove, while Paul said in his own defense, "I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges?" But Paul said, "I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, "You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go." Play the Roman card. Yes, that's exactly what he did. And right. And not only that, he had played it this way. He had, by giving Paul the choice, Paul, if he chooses to go to Jerusalem, Festus knew that Paul had cooked his own goose and that he was going to be in their hands. All right. But if Paul chooses to go to Rome, which he does appeal to Caesar, and he's going to be sent to Rome, then he's out of Festus's hair. And he says, "To Caesar you shall go." So he's already made the decision. All he has to do now is have a little backup. And that's what's going to be happening a little bit later on when King Agrippa comes to town. Okay, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind. All right. But Paul maintains his innocence. And he goes on to say, Paul very strongly goes on to say, if I'm a wrongdoer and deserve death, go ahead and kill me. And so, that just drove home the point that, again, the Jews did not have any evidence. They had a lot of false claims. And they certainly didn't have enough to put him to death. And he knew that the Romans knew that. Okay? So, Festus has given Paul that choice, and he's going to go to Rome. Nero is the emperor. And what I read about Nero is that in his first 5 years, he's a fairly decent ruler. But he doesn't stay that way. All right. All right. So does everybody got the picture of where we're headed with this, right? Okay. So now we go to verse 13, and the next part is a little lengthy. It goes from 13 to 22. And here comes King Agrippa. Okay, so let me read this, and then there's several things to kind of sort out here, unpack. So chapter 25, verse 13. Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. And while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation upon him. And I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. And so after they had assembled here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man be brought. And when the accusers stood up, they began bringing the charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a certain dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. And being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. And Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So here comes King Agrippa. Now this is the great grandson of Herod, who had tried to kill Jesus. His grandfather had John the Baptist killed, his father had James killed. That was Agrippa the first, and that's the one that was eaten by worms when he accepted the praise of men, remember? And so this, again, Festus, and how did Agrippa get here in the first place? This was not, Festus did not send for Agrippa. And even if he had, he didn't send for Agrippa to help him with Paul. But now that he's here, now that Agrippa is here, and Agrippa is regarded as an expert in Jewish customs and Jewish religion. All right? So this is fortuitous for Festus, because now he can kind of get Agrippa up to speed with this problem, and that's basically what he says. This guy was left behind by Felix, and I've got to deal with him. And I just want your opinion on the matter. So Agrippa doesn't have any official capacity here. He's just a visitor. But he is going to be, but Festus can allow him to be an advisor. And that's exactly what he's going to do. And the beautiful thing of all this is Paul is going to turn this into another sermon, right? Okay, right in front of everybody, all right? Almost as if he had planned it himself. But of course, this is the providence of God at work and God's will, okay? So, and again, Festus tells Agrippa, you know what? I told the Jews, we have to have face-to-face interaction on these matters. People that have accused somebody, they got to come forward, they got to bring charges, and they got to do it in person. All right. So he's telling Agrippa, I've done everything by the book. Okay, and so and then, he tries to explain to Agrippa about, in the first place, he says, I thought this was a really bad guy. I thought the Jews had captured some kind of, he doesn't say insurrectionist or anybody like that, but he thought, as worked up as the Jews were, this must be a really bad character. But he tells Agrippa, really, these people are just in a disagreement. And it's almost as if he's telling Agrippa, I really don't want to deal with this, but I've got to. It's been left to me. And then Agrippa says, you know what, I'd like to meet the man myself. And Agrippa kind of comes off as somewhat curious, but really, I think Agrippa is just wanting to be entertained. And that kind of comes up at the beginning of the next chapter. Another thing that kind of stood out when I looked at this is in the very first verse of this, verse 13, several days had elapsed after King Agrippa. By the way, Bernice is King Agrippa's sister. Several days had elapsed. So see, Paul was not the first on the agenda. He was almost an afterthought until Festus remembered, oh, you know what, I got this leftover problem. So, but now he's going to bring Paul in chapter 26. All right, so, there's verses 23 through 27. Anybody got anything they want to throw in here? There's a lot of moving parts between Festus and Agrippa and Paul and all the circumstances. All right, verse 23 and to the rest of the chapter, Paul is before Agrippa. And so on the next day, when Agrippa had come together with Bernice amid great pomp, and had entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you behold this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. So now this all comes out publicly. Festus introduces Paul to Agrippa, and so we have great pomp there in verse 23. This is kind of a Roman dog and pony show, for lack of a better term. If it had been the other way around, King Agrippa and Bernice or whoever would have put on a big show for Festus, if Festus had visited King Agrippa. So it's just something that, you see heads of state visit another head of state, and there's military bands, and there's, photo ops and that kind of a thing. And that's kind of, in some way, that's kind of what we're looking at here. Yes, sir.
The Roman thing is, the Romans were not qualified to rule on religious disagreement.
Right.
They didn't know enough about it and didn't care.
Right. And that you're right.
They had trouble finding it.
Exactly. Yeah.
They didn't know what they were doing.
Well, they all want to wash their hands, just like Pilate did too. Felix did it, and Festus is trying to do it. So you're right. They're not qualified, and they're not competent. And so Festus wants to use Agrippa's expertise to kind of back up what he has already decided. So very good point. Thank you, Bill. All right, so, but Festus reasserts in this introduction of Paul to Agrippa that he does not believe Paul deserves to die. And Agrippa now has enough information to at least kind of know what's going on with Paul. And we find out that, again, I mentioned this a moment ago, that Festus wants Agrippa to help him write a document or a letter so that when he sends Paul to Rome, which he's already decided to do, then Festus can basically tell the emperor why he is sending Paul to Rome. And that's how the chapter ends. And then in chapter 26, Agrippa takes a turn, and he is going to speak briefly to Paul, and then he's going to give Paul the floor, basically. And this brings Acts chapter 9, verse 15 into play. Remember when Paul was still known as Saul, and he was on the road to Damascus, and he was blinded. In the process of all that, God tells, who we now say is Paul, God told him, when he's talking to Ananias, I believe, he's saying, he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. All right? And so now he is about to be presented to Agrippa II, the king of a kind of a client nation to the northeast of Judea. So that verse comes in to play. Agrippa is going to give Paul the floor, and we'll read, verse 1 and 2, and then I'm just going to go ahead and read down through verse 11. Try to get as far as we can into this. And Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. Verse 2, in regard to all the things. Now remember, Paul is speaking not only to Agrippa and Festus, but there's a lot of other people here as well, prominent people. In regard to all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I'm about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So then all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem. Since they have known about me for a long time previously, if they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion, and now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God night and day. And for this hope, O King, I am being accused by the Jews. Why is it considered incredible among you people if God does not raise the dead? So, Paul is going to, he's going to use Agrippa's knowledge that he knew Agrippa had. And he is trying to lay down a kind of a foundation of not just who he is, but why he's doing what he's doing. That is, preaching the gospel, right? And he has done this time and time again, okay? So he acknowledges Agrippa as an expert in Jewish law and customs. Paul goes back to that Jewish heritage, establishing his deep connection to Judaism. He was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. And in verse 8, and I think verse 8 and 22, we may not get to 22 and 20 or 27 today, but those three verses are linked together. And here's why I say this. He brings up, this is where he differs from the Jews. And that is that he preaches the resurrected Lord, Jesus. And that's who he's referring to. But the way he does it is to King Agrippa. Agrippa, you know that God has raised people from the dead. Now, in the Old Testament, now see, they didn't have the New Testament written down like we do, right? We all know that. But Agrippa would have known Elijah raised the widow's son back to life. Who did Elisha raise? The Shunammite woman. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong. All right. What about when the man was thrown into Elisha's grave? The man that had died was thrown into Elisha's grave. What happened to that man when he touched Elisha's bones? Came back to life. You think Agrippa wouldn't have known at least one of those stories? What about Ezekiel and the dry bones? Remember the dry bones? A lot of people came back to life. So there were a lot of examples. And see, Paul is playing into Agrippa's knowledge. And in verse 22 and 27 is where he lays the trap. May not be the best way to put it, but he kind of lays a trap for Agrippa. And then in verse 27, he closes the trap on Agrippa. And he almost gets Agrippa to become a Christian. Because Agrippa can see, oh, I see what you're doing. Now you almost persuade me to become a Christian. So those three verses are linked, I think, in that way, somehow. All right? But I got a little ahead of myself. But that's the first part of Paul's defense before Agrippa. is that point. That's why I'm here. That's really the reason, Agrippa, that Paul, that's why I'm here before you today. It's not because anything I've been accused of, except that you can accuse me of believing that God can raise people from the dead, which he's obviously talking about Jesus. Okay, so verse 9 through 11, Paul continues, so then I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them often in the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. So he is telling Agrippa, I've been what? Zealous. I've been zealous. Nobody can top what I was doing. Right? And he believed it at the time, that he was doing what was right? And then, verses 12 through 18, he begins to tell Agrippa, here's a paradigm shift. Here is when I turned 180 degrees. And then he tells what happened to him in Acts 9, the same thing that he had told Felix in Acts chapter 22. And I'll read it, but we won't spend a whole bunch of time on this because we already have. But just imagine, when I'm reading verses 12, if I can make it through verse 18, just imagine you're Agrippa the second, and you're hearing this for the very first time. We've heard it dozens of times, but try to hear it with Agrippa's ears, okay? So this is Paul before Agrippa. While thus engaged, I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priest. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But arise and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things which I will appear to you, delivering you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the dominion of Satan to God, in order that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. So he's using this, what had happened to him in Acts chapter 9, to explain to Agrippa, this is why I'm here. This is my purpose. And I saw this, and I was blinded and all this, and all these things happened to me basically so that I can preach. And he sneaks the gospel in right there in front of Agrippa and everybody else by telling this story one more time, right? So he goes over being on the road, and the reason he was on the road to Damascus, he wasn't just walking down the street. He was en route to persecute more Christians. That's what he was on his way to do. And then he heard the voice of Jesus, and he responded to that by spreading the gospel with the same zealous attitude as when he was a Pharisee punishing Christians. And so what's his mission in verse 18? To open the blind eyes from darkness to light, to get people to leave Satan, go to God through Jesus. He preached forgiveness of sins through Jesus. And then he preaches an inheritance among God's people. And that is the part the Jews could not take. Right? How dare you say that these Gentiles, for example, could be saved? It's just not, we're not taking this. But that is Paul, and that's what he tells Agrippa. Agrippa wanted to hear him, and Paul let him have it. Right? Okay. I don't think we're going to get very much further today, and so I'm not going to read anything else. But verses 9, we'll pick it up there, chapter 26, verses 19. And we'll get King Agrippa's response. I'll come back to that link that I tried to make where Paul is speaking to Agrippa, and he's appealing to Agrippa's knowledge of his knowledge of Judaism, his knowledge of the Scriptures, his knowledge of what we call the Old Testament. And he is going to, he's not content with just telling Agrippa that he is a preacher. He is going to preach to him, and he is going to challenge him. While Paul's trying to save his life, but at the same time, he's using this as a way to speak the truth about God to Agrippa. All righty. Thank y'all very much. I appreciate your attention. Y'all have a wonderful rest of the day.